As always, thank you to those that keep joining these spaces efforts. This one's going to be a little bit different from the way that I usually run them, primarily focused more on the geopolitical foreign policy side of things. But I do think that a discussion like this is going to be helpful for traders and investors, independent of one's view on the market. Being aware of the environment around us is always important. My name is Michael Guyette, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Max Abrams. Max, I reached out to you because I wanted to get an expert's view on what's going on from foreign policy perspective. A lot of interesting cross currents we're going to touch on. But introduce yourself to the audience. Who are you? What's your background? How did you get involved, interested in foreign policy? And what are you doing currently?
Yeah, I really see myself as wearing two hats. I mean, my main profession is professor of political science at Northeastern University. Political science is pretty big. Within that, there's international relations. Within that, there's international security. So basically, that's my focus at the university. I publish a lot about all sorts of terrorist group dynamics, civil wars, insurgency, and teach about international relations, national security. But then my other hat is sort of a public intellectual. And so I'm tweeting and doing interviews, and my domain is a little bit broader there than my published work. But I'm interested basically in the world, especially where there's bloodshed. So maybe we'll talk about that.
So I had seen some of your prior discussions around terrorism, especially more in the height of the Iraq War and Afghanistan war, obviously. But I don't hear too much about the war on terrorism. Seems like the media has gone past that. Are we still in this kind of broader war and it's just not getting coverage? Where are we on that side of things?
Yeah, that's a really good way to start. You think back to really just maybe, around 2017, 16, and Islamic State was just all over the news. That was just a massive issue because Islamic State engendered fear like no other group. It was just completely unrestrained in its use of violence. It would attack absolutely any target. It wanted to strike every country in the world. And then it coupled that with social media and bragged about it, as a force multiplier of that terror. And what ended up happening was that because Islamic State was just so extreme in that way, it elicited the largest counterterrorism coalition ever formed. And the group was no match for that very rare consensus within the international community that this group was bad and it needed to be annihilated. ISIS brought together countries which typically don't otherwise get along. It brought together Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United States, Europe, Russia, even Syria. And so ever since then, the complete pummeling of the Islamic State, the destruction of the caliphate, international terrorism hasn't been nearly as big of a concern. There is, an interesting development, though, was January 6th. And during that time and shortly after, there was a lot of talk about how, domestic extremism / domestic terrorism in the United States, was the new big thing, that it had eclipsed the Salafi jihadists as the biggest terrorism threat, and that really needed to be our focus when it comes to national security. But then more recently, since February 2022, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we're back to talking about great power politics and the focus on non-state actors, whether it's international or domestic, has really taken a back seat. In terms of the future of terrorism, as your audience knows, terrorism is a tactic. And so it's not dependent on any, specific type of actor or any specific, region. And so, in that sense, I do think I have good job security because terrorism is here to stay. It's just that the degree of it and how it manifests itself will evolve, of course, over time.
Yeah, and I'm going to make the assumption, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, that because we have given up so much of our privacy rights and data is now accessible by pretty much every single major government you can imagine, that on the one hand, that makes the terrorism dynamic not as surprising because there's some data that can be somewhat predictive of something happening. But, obviously that comes at a larger cost you can argue for society.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely trade-offs. There's also where I thought you were going to go with the question is basically who benefits more when it comes to, globalization and technology. Is it the non-state actors or is it the government? That's a really tough one to answer because it clearly benefits both. But yeah, you're quite right. There are definite trade-offs in terms of defending sort of our physical security while maintaining our liberty. And that's a sort of a recurrent conversation among political scientists is what exactly is the relationship between what we call regime type, that is to say, whether a government is a democracy or authoritarian government, and the nature of the terrorism threat. In general, most people think that democracy is some form of a liability when it comes to counterterrorism. That's why when terrorism threat levels rise, governments tend to crack down and maybe erode your civil liberties. I'm a skeptic of that view for the reason that when you look at the countries in the world which suffer the most terrorism, they're they're highly illiberal. So you would think that democracies, according to the conventional wisdom, would attract the lion's share of terrorism if it's some kind of a liability. But actually, democracies seem to be more immune when it comes to the likelihood of being attacked. Although terrorism is an international problem, it's not equally distributed around the world. Really, just about, say, 9 countries attract the lion's share of terrorism. And they're all super messed up countries, not just in terms of political violence, but also in terms of their polities, in terms of their political systems, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Nigeria, places like that have way more terrorism than any sort of liberal democracy. So I tend to be quite cautious when it comes to the natural inclination to crack down on democracy in order to fight terrorism. And the other thing is that, and this relates, of course, is that when governments crack down too much on terrorists, they tend to, well, you can never crack down too much on terrorists, but what tends to happen is the crackdown is indiscriminate and it ends up harming people who shouldn't be harmed. And that in and of itself is a major catalyst for more terrorism. So governments really need to be quite selective in terms of how they go after the terrorists. And when you're an illiberal government, you're more likely to, wield your sword in an indiscriminate fashion, which radicalizes the population and partly explains why there's more terrorism in those countries.
This is going to be a strange way to frame it, but are there cycles when it comes to terrorism? Because going back to that point, there's the argument, for example, that all of the youth in Iraq, for example, all they remember are soldiers and bombs, and that's what they grew up under. And as they get older, then they kind of go the terrorist route. I mean, or use that tactic. Are there cycles that you've seen historically that would suggest that maybe it's not getting as much coverage in the media because at the margin has lessened in terms of the number of headlines, but that we're going to see another big wave in the future?
That's a great question as well. There is a scholar named David Rappaport who was a professor at UCLA, and he basically periodized the history of modern terrorism by showing that it does develop in terms of waves, where waves can be separated over time, largely in terms of the ideological zeitgeist of the world at that time. So to concretize what I'm talking about, for example, there was an anarchist wave, which was very anti-government. There was an anti-colonial wave to end, colonization. There was a new left wave after that in the 60s and 70s to protest the Vietnam War. Far left groups were involved in that. And then after the Iranian Revolution, he says, began the religious wave. The thing is that according to Rappaport, a wave should last about one generation, where the younger people are more excited, politically, and maybe use political violence for it. But then they get older and they get tired, and then we'd see another wave. But the religious wave, which is said to begin during the Iranian Revolution, it seems to be going longer. And so, it's not really clear how long that wave will last. Part of the reason, I think, is because the world has changed so much with globalization, and it makes it easier to spread not only political ideas, but also tactical information. Other people might push back and say, the way of understanding international terrorism, isn't that great. One of the criticisms that I have is that it suggests that at any one time, there would only be one sort of ideology which is motivating political violence. But actually, I think we're living in a much more interesting time than that. I think that there are different ideological currents which can create radicals, and those radicals from different ideological currents actually feed off of each other. They interact. They're not discrete. They're not fully independent. So like Antifa, for example, turns out in numbers in order to protest against the far right. The far right is protesting against Islamists. Islamists are protesting against the far right. So in that sense, I don't think it's useful to think about it in terms of waves, but rather competing ideologies who have extremists who are feeding off of each other.
How has the technology enabled the proliferation of extremist ideas? And look, I always go back to the point that the internet was designed to arguably level the playing field as a communication source of information, all this stuff. But oftentimes, the most extreme things rise to the top, right? Because the middle is hard to get attention. I've got to assume that these ideologies, it gets even more fringe every year because it's kind of like the most extreme of the most extreme keeps on then rising to the top.
Yeah, I mean, there is a belief, certainly, that if it bleeds, it leads. So certainly this would incentivize people to become so extreme that they use violence, often against a civilian target, or what we call terrorism. So there's definitely some basis to that. What you're talking about is extremeness. It sounds like not so much in terms of tactics, but in terms of political preferences. And that's, it's interesting to think about that sort of empirically in terms of whether that's true. I'm not sure, honestly, exactly where I stand on that, partly because although it is relatively easy, I think, to scientifically ascribe behavior, tactical behavior, in terms of its extremeness, it's actually a lot harder to do when it comes to one's political preferences. An extreme political position for one person may be perfectly moderate for another. In some ways, one might say that even very mainstream, outlets, say like CNN or MSNBC, many people would find areas that they talk about as actually extreme, not in terms of where they sit within the American public, but in terms of how their views line up with their own. And of course, these mainstream outlets attract a lot of attention. So I'm not totally sure what the relationship is between the extremeness of one's politics and how much attention that they get. There does tend to be a general view, which I think is wrong, which is that, these mainstream outlets, must be very moderate and that extreme ideas come from, rogue places like Russia today. But actually, I believe that most misinformation tends to come from places which are perceived by audience members as moderate and sensible and credible. And that's why the information takes off in the first place.
Yeah, no, interesting perspective on that. Okay, let's talk about just on the geopolitical side. Obviously the ongoing dynamics with Russia, Ukraine, and U.S. policy. I had a person on a Twitter space last week who was very adamant in this idea that it was a colossal foreign policy error to cut Russia off because it showed that a country can be cut off from the U.S.'s financial institutions and still be kicking and surviving and doing what it's doing. Lay out from your vantage point kind of where we are currently on U.S.-Russia relations, and if you think that we've had some blunders here in the last year and a half.
Sure. I think that this is actually a very evenly matched war in a way. And that's why what we're seeing now is a very horrible, bloody war of attrition with seemingly no end in sight. On the Western side, you have in some ways more impressive weapons. You have more countries providing them. The Biden administration has exhibited a lot of leadership in rallying, especially NATO countries, to support Ukraine. There's been, over $100 billion invested or whatever. The weapons supply doesn't seem to be getting cut off anytime soon. In fact, it might be expanded to include F-16s. That's an ongoing conversation. Ukraine is a big country and their population is getting decimated. Their national sovereignty has been invaded and threatened, and they view themselves as in an existential conflict. And so obviously they have tremendous resolve to fight this war for themselves, but it's also a proxy war for NATO countries. On the Russian side, you have obviously in a straight comparison between Russia and Ukraine, there are a lot of Russian advantages. The Russian population is much bigger. Some of their weapons stocks, it turns out, are not only bigger than Ukraine's, but bigger than all of NATO's in terms of their artillery. And so they have a population advantage. In some ways, they actually have a weapons advantage. I think they're more low-tech weapons, but apparently that's what you need in this kind of war of attrition. And then an interesting question of debate is how resolved is the Russian public? Obviously, the Ukrainian public couldn't be more resolved. And this is a matter of debate. It can be difficult to ascertain the answer because, Russia isn't a democracy. And so oftentimes you'll see in the press stories of how there's an impending civil war within Russia, that Putin is weak, that there's a mutiny that, that is going to usher him out. Whereas other people say, you know what? Putin actually is quite popular in Russia, and there's no obvious challenge to his political rule. And so that is a matter of debate. What I do think is that as the West supports Ukraine with longer range weapons, that increasingly, and we're already seeing a lot of this, Ukraine will strike maybe even more into Russia, and that will actually firm up Russian support. So I actually see that as counterproductive. It reduces the likelihood that Russia will, or that Putin will bargain with Zelensky, and it could well expand the war. I'm a critic of this war in many different ways, but I think that it's extraordinarily dangerous, not just for the two countries most directly involved, but actually for the world, I am concerned that the war will expand. It could expand it could escalate not just within Ukraine and not just within Russia, but it honestly has the potential to become World War III. We shouldn't rule out the possibility that actually it could go nuclear. I'm not making a prediction there in terms of saying that you know, there's a greater likelihood than not that it will go nuclear. I don't think that that's the case. But when you're dealing with risk, risk is a function not just of the likelihood of an event happening, but the consequence, the gravity, if it were to happen. And so, given how serious a nuclear war would be, we need to take that possibility seriously and do everything that we can to avert it. So, I've been calling for negotiations. I don't like the approach of providing Ukraine with a blank check. I certainly don't like the idea of ramping up its weapons and saying that, Zelensky, we're going to be with you to the last Ukrainian. I think that that's dangerous, not just for the Ukrainians and the Russians, but again, for all of us. So I tend to be more of a dove as well as a critic of the establishment on the Ukraine war.
But there is an escalation of commitment on the U.S. side, right? I mean, I'm with you on the blank check, and I think the American public is saying, like if you see those headlines, they're not exactly fair, but they say, you're sending all this money to Ukraine, but you still have water in Flint, Michigan, right? That still has chemicals in there. It's just so it's kind of a misalignment of resources. But I have to imagine from a political standpoint, it's hard to suddenly step away after so much money has been spent.
And it's not just the money; it's also the stakes and the expectations. This is an administration which said that the Ukraine war is so important, not just to Ukraine but also to us, because it will determine the viability of democracy and freedom and the rules-based order. It will determine whether China makes a move on Taiwan, whether Russia will see us as appeasers and then try to take Europe the way Hitler did during World War II. They really blew up this rhetoric in such maximalist terms. And they also painted a rosy scenario of the so-called counteroffensive, that at a certain point, Ukraine was going to really go on the offensive and turn the tide. And official White House, spokespeople, as well as generals who are, all over mainstream media, overstated how successful the so-called counteroffensive would be. And now it's all bogged down. And so what is Biden going to do? I mean, if he looks to compromise, then, what is he putting in jeopardy? Freedom and democracy and the rules-based order, and giving a green light for, Putin to take Europe and China to take Taiwan. So I think part of it has to do with the rhetoric, which really got away from the Biden administration and the Biden media. And of course, the reason why they did that was to soften up the American public, so that they are more generous in terms of U.S. support for Ukraine. But the strategy really only works when you can see visible Ukrainian success militarily. And that's honestly not what we're really seeing now.
Obviously, there's a lot of spin when it comes to media in the U.S., but how has the foreign policy side of the U.S. interacted with what China is trying to do with Russia and Ukraine?
Well, in the course of this war against Ukraine, we've seen changes in how the foreign policy establishment is talking about China. For as long as I can remember, going back, a couple decades, people talked all the time about the rise of China and how China was going to challenge the United States and maybe is challenging the United States as an economic power. There's been talk about that in the United States going back many, many, many decades, but really only over the course of the past year or two is China framed as a true military adversary, which will be the location of a next war. And so, for that reason, even though we're experiencing the largest war since World War II in Ukraine and Russia, for many people, that's especially within the foreign policy establishment, this is a prelude to war with China. What's interesting politically is that Democrats tend to be more hawkish when it comes to the war, against Russia. They tend to be more anti-Russia, more pro-Ukraine than Republicans. The Republican Party's, very interesting and divided, but in general, what I'm saying is true. If you look at polling numbers, if you look at votes in Congress, for example. But when it comes to China, it's the opposite. Republicans tend to be more hawkish against China than Democrats. My own view, my own stance on this, I'm actually dovish on both. I think that we really need to focus on winding down the war in Ukraine, and I do think that there is a potential compromise that could be reached there. It's not like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict where there's no bargaining space between the parties because, they want exactly the same thing. There is room for compromise in that war, and I'd like to see it be pursued. And I also think that all of this saber rattling against China, although I understand that it's intended to deter China in order to contain China, it actually can have the opposite effect by making the United States seem unreasonable and bellicose. And it could basically become a self-fulfilling prophecy where we're so worried about Chinese aggression that we inadvertently contribute to it.
Yeah, and yeah, obviously the lingering concern remains what China does with Taiwan, which we can maybe touch on in a bit. But walk us through how foreign policy is set. I know that sounds like a strange question, but there's all kinds of different players, I'm sure, that are involved in helping to sort of set direction from military to academia itself. Do you get a sense that the academia side of foreign policy is not as given as much credence as those on the ground or those that have other influence to the president?
I'm disappointed with the academic community when it comes to foreign policy. Academics are in a unique position to potentially be useful when it comes to discussing foreign policy decision making in a number of ways. I mean, there are, quite a few, smart professors who study foreign policy. They are often methodologically quite strong. They have PhDs. They know how to run regressions like crazy. They know how to test hypotheses. They have methodological training, and they're also more independent in terms of their funding sources. They tend, they're paid mainly, if not exclusively, by their institution, a university, which doesn't really care all that much whether they're hawkish or dovish on one war or another. They're not most likely going to lose their job over that. So they're smart, they're well trained in a way, they're more independent, right? And in all sorts of other issues, they tend to be very empirically minded. They can test all sorts of things. But in practice, I don't actually think that within international relations, professors have done a very good job of making policy better. And I think part of the reason why has to do with the temperament that is required to become a professor. The truth is that there are a lot of conformists within academia. They became professors because, they had mentors and they networked with other people and they tried to not, ruffle feathers. So there are a lot of conformists, there are a lot of sort of meek people who don't, in my opinion, sufficiently exercise their tenure because, they want their reputations intact. They want to be cited. They want to maintain their networks. They want to be popular. So I think that there are a lot of missed opportunities when it comes to the role that academia could play. The thing, I've been affiliated with think tanks for many years, all sorts of different think tanks. The think tanks are advantaged over the academics because they tend to be louder. If are a fellow, say at Brookings, and you write honestly, some objectively, really simple, you know, it could even be like a statement on a letter, and you read it off. Like you're going to have media just descend on Brookings. You're going to have an enormous audience. You could be saying something which has been said 100 times previously, or it could just be there could be no methodological basis for what you're saying, but you get a really big audience, and you're more likely to have impact. And so, and honestly, a big problem with the think tanks is that they're not as independent. They're taking foreign money like crazy. Tens of millions of dollars from countries, even countries that are well-known sponsors of terrorism. So there are different trade-offs to the profession. Again, I'm a full-time professor, but I'm also, I work with the think tanks, and I see problems with both of them.
The conformist point is interesting that it's hard to be contrarian as a professor. I think is an intriguing point. Let's talk about how foreign policy could change depending upon what happens next year with the election. And I know there's all kinds of nuances in terms of not just who leads the party, but the party itself. Um, do you suspect that there's going to be some pretty aggressive 180 type of foreign policy changes if Trump gets back in or something else happens on the election front?
I'm of different minds of that. When you think of the war in Afghanistan or the war in Iraq, we were in those countries at great cost. In some ways, more cost than the Ukraine war because we had Americans being killed, in the thousands. And we were there on the ground without any real progress. In some ways, you could say we made it worse. And yet there was no sort of American public outcry to get out of those countries. It wasn't that salient of an issue, really. And it certainly took a long time. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years, So the fact that, we're not achieving our foreign policy goals in Ukraine is no guarantee that the American public will really prioritize that issue and force a policy change like, say, during the Vietnam War, where there were mass protests. I haven't seen anything like that in the United States. In Europe, when I travel there, I do see, protests, but still, they're a marginal segment of those national populations. I do think that as the war goes on, and if it gets worse, and honestly, I do think it's going to get worse. I think that Russia is going to escalate. We're already seeing this in terms of it's being more indiscriminate in its targeting, taking out, civilian infrastructure. The war also is sort of slowly, potentially broadening beyond that dyadic war between Ukraine and Russia. There's more talk about Belarus, right? The Wagner Group, which is basically a Russian paramilitary group, is setting up shop in Belarus. And that's a concern to Poland, which Poland's actually critical of the United States for not being hawkish enough against the Russians. Russia is saying that if Belarus were struck that Russia would regard that as an attack against Russia. And similarly, because of Article 5 of NATO, any kind of an attack against Poland, a Russian or a Belarus attack against Poland, that that could trigger Article 5 of NATO, getting the United States directly in war, with Russia. So I think that there are a number of evolving and growing tripwires in that conflict, which could make it even more dangerous, especially for Americans. Now, how the American public responds to this threat, is an interesting question. On the one hand, they could say, you know what? Maybe this war isn't a vital American interest. Maybe it's too dangerous. Maybe we want out. On the other hand, I could see, American opinion makers going on media and saying, look how dangerous this is. It's all the more reason for America to double down and increase its involvement directly, maybe against Russia. So it really depends on the framing. I'm a big believer that elites, especially on TV, go a long way in terms of determining what the citizenry thinks and what they conclude about what our foreign policy moves should be. And I think it would be tough for Biden to extricate himself from this conflict because in a way this is Biden's war when it comes to American perceptions, American involvement. Any other leader, I think, would have an easier time getting out of the war. I think that it's impossible for me to imagine a Democratic leader, doing an about face, a 180, as you said, on the Ukraine war, just because it's also a Democrat war. Whereas I think there's more maneuverability, if you will, on the Republican side. I do think that if Trump were elected, and I wouldn't bet on that, I think that most likely the Democrats will win. And if, Biden is well enough, then he'll, be the president again. But on the Republican side, it is more interesting. Both Trump and Ron DeSantis are less enthusiastic, clearly, about this war than the Democratic leadership. And that would most likely result in a change. We would see a different set of foreign policy priorities than the war in Ukraine. For example, Republicans are talking a lot about U.S. relations with Mexico. If there's a Republican president, that will become an issue. Specifically, there's growing interest among the Republican leadership of treating Mexican cartels as almost as terrorists, if you will, even labeling them as foreign terrorist organizations, using, kinetic operations, even military means to go into Mexico, possibly in defiance of the wishes of the government there, to directly confront Mexican cartels, which are being blamed for, probably correctly, for supplying fentanyl into the United States, contributing to, migration issues, illegals coming in. So that would be more of a priority under a Republican administration. It sort of goes with, the idea of America first, because it's a focus much more on America's backyard. And also, I think that there will be an escalation against China. It's even more likely that we would see that under a Republican administration. So I think foreign policy interest and involvement would change depending on who the next president is.
Do you get a sense that if China were to make a move on Taiwan, it would be an armed conflict where we're involved, that we would get involved militarily, or would the response still be, just give money to Taiwan and see if they can fend for themselves?
I think that America would go to war for Taiwan. The way the United States tends to wage war is it makes specific arguments about the stakes of that conflict, but also much broader ones in terms of the effects, on the rules-based order, on freedom, on democracy. So there would be all sorts of arguments about why it's imperative to defend Taiwan and how, if we don't, America would lose all credibility and, the political system would suffer grievously. So, yeah, I would expect that kind of maximalist interpretation, and that would go a long way in terms of rallying Americans to support direct military involvement. However, whereas Biden has gotten a lot of international support, especially European NATO support, in order to punish Russia, I do think that we wouldn't be able to count on European support in the same way. There are a number of countries in Europe which actually are critical of Biden for not being hawkish against Russia enough. Whereas with China, the United States would be leading that coalition, and there would be much less international support, in part because China is a much more important country economically, and it's not as reviled as Russia is. So I think that the United States, I really hope that we don't go to war against China. I don't think it's inevitable. I think that it's important to push back on claims that, the United States, it's in their vital interest that, democracy, freedom, all that, is going to, certainly for Americans, will be, in peril. I tend to think that the United States, it's often overrated how much the US can positively affect other areas of the world militarily. I would like the United States to be more humble when it comes to exercising its military and mainly using it as a deterrent to defend ourselves rather than basically interjecting ourselves at very, very high risk against nuclear countries, going into other spheres of influence. I think that, Taiwan is part of China, or, right next to China, and Ukraine is, right next to Russia. And, the United States is overactive when it comes to trying to determine military outcomes that are, based far away. So yeah, I have deep concerns about the growing conflict with China as well as the ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
Max, for those who want to track more of your thoughts and work, where would you point them to?
Well, most fun would be on Twitter. But, I also publish a lot of stuff that would probably just bore the hell out of your audience. But Google Scholar, I do have a book. I'll take this opportunity, which I appreciate you're giving me, called Rules for Rebels: The Science of Victory in Militant History. And basically, what I show is that there's a lot of variation in terms of whether militant groups succeed or fail in terms of achieving their political agendas. For example, in South Africa, the ANC was effective in ending the apartheid. In Lebanon, Hezbollah was effective in terms of expelling, American and French troops in the early 1980s. By contrast, other militant groups haven't achieved their goals. Like the Islamic State, for example, doesn't have caliphate. And so the question that I ask is, why do some groups succeed and why do other groups fail? And I look at hundreds of militant groups all over the world throughout history, and I discern three key rules which, if militant leaders follow, substantially increases the odds of political success. And basically, I use all sorts of different methodological approaches in order to show the science of victory in militant history. And so, if any of your listeners are interested in that, that's my book, Rules for Rebels.
It's a good place to wrap this Twitter space up. Again, this will be an edited podcast under Lead Lag Live. Thank you to everybody for joining, and thank you, Max, for the discussion. Really insightful.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Max. Cheers, everybody.